Hi, I'm Susan Dalgety. I'm the co-editor of The Women Who Wouldn't Wheesht and a writer and journalist up here in Scotland.
And I'm Lucy Hunter Blackburn, the other co-editor of the book and past civil servant and now an independent researcher and analyst
And writer.
and writer.
I'm Jane,
And I'm Bets,
and this is
Insightful Sisters.
on the 15th of February 2023. Nicola Sturgeon resigned as the First Minister of Scotland, brought down by her support for gender recognition reform in Scotland. Today, we're fortunate enough to be interviewing Susan Dalgety and Lucy Hunter Blackburn, the editors of The Women Who Wouldn't Wheesht. In this amazing book, a collection of personal accounts of the 5 years running up to Sturgeon's resignation, Susan and Lucy capture a moment. Susan, Lucy, thank you so much for being with us.
Lovely to be here.
Welcome. When we thought about this name, Insightful Sisters, it's got a pun on insight, the way it's spelt. And we really thought about what had happened in Scotland, what had happened to the women of Scotland, and how they stood up, showing that perception, but also that ability to provoke a response, which, the other meaning of insight, I suppose. So we're just so delighted to have you here tonight. Can I start by asking you a little bit about yourselves? Just tell us a little bit about yourselves, your backgrounds, your lives before gender recognition, if you can remember that far back.
Quite hard
That's
to
quite
remember
hard.
that far back. I've had a varied career, local politician in Edinburgh, journalist. I worked in government as press officer for a former First Minister, not for Nicola Sturgeon, it has to be said. And I've travelled a lot. And it was actually during my a visit to Malawi in 2017 when I read online in the Edinburgh Evening News, I think it was, or I wrote about it in the Edinburgh Evening News, because I had just read a story about Lily Madigan, I think, who still is, a young man in the Labour Party in Yorkshire, Sheffield, I think, who had decided he was a woman and therefore had ousted a long-standing women's officer from the post and was now the women's officer, and he was 19, a 19-year-old boy. And I had known the bubbling away was Maria Miller and all the stuff, the GRA of 2004, and then, the kind of move towards a self-ID, but I hadn't really spent much time thinking about it. To be honest, I was traveling a lot during that period, so my thoughts were on other things. But that sitting in a little hotel in one of the poorest countries in the world, reading about this, and I'll still laugh about it because it just seemed to me to be the most outrageous, ridiculous thing I had ever heard, and that the Labour Party was going along with it. So that was my peak moment, and I still remember where I was when I read about Lily Madigan. And here I am now.
Oh, wow. I can imagine that. Lucy, what about you?
Right. So if you go back a bit, I started off doing 20 years working in and around government, mainly in the Scottish government as it becomes a while into the devolution period. I worked on local government funding, very sort of schools, education. So it was a very standard policy job. And I worked on the Scotland Act and setting up the Parliament. So I was interested in how the state works, how you make it work well. So I did that, but a point came when my child was quite young. I'd been through some quite difficult sort of loss in my family, and I got the chance to take a voluntary redundancy scheme when I was in my mid-40s, and thought, you know what, actually, I've had a good run, and it's a slightly inflexible career with a young child. I would like to have a bit more control over my time. I'll leave. So I found myself falling accidentally into scrutiny of campaigning.
Between you, your experience has all meant that you were looking at policies of the key
Yeah.
the key players, if you like,
Yes.
before gender recognition started to be a thing. You were already all over all of those papers, weren't you?
We understood
Yeah.
both how government civil service work, but also how the politicians work. So we understood the landscape.
I think that's important. So we had a kind of inherent confidence.
So you're sort of irritants in training in the background
Oh,
before.
we were past the training stage. We were known irritants in the system, I would say. So between us, there was Susan, there was me, there were Kath, there was Lisa, all kind of watching and taking a close interest in.
So you're interested in cultural change, I suppose, and then this movement of gender ideology sweeps across the world. But why Scotland in particular? Why what was it about Scotland that made it sort of such a fertile ground, if you like?
I'm laughing because we ask ourselves this quite often.
I bet you do.
And during the process of pulling the book together, we prodded and at this. Why Scotland? I mean, it has to be said that it was actually why the UK, because remember Maria Miller and others, the Conservative Party, Theresa May was a big supporter of self-ID. So there was this and I think that was that kind of culture of the be kind, and we've already got gender recognition reform in 2004, so the world didn't cave in when that happened. So this is the next logical step. And for one nation Tories, like I assume Theresa May that was an easy win for her to show how thoughtful and kind and progressive she was. But it took hold in Scotland in a way that was quite astonishing. And Lucy will talk about the policy capture, which is very important. But I think a lot of it has to do with it's a small country. So a small country with a very powerful devolved administration. The Scottish government has power over many areas of people's lives, and civil society, the politicians, the media all know each other. It's a very small country. And I think it was much easier because of that for something like self-ID to take hold. But
so there's other things to throw into the mix. So devolution comes along in 1999. The Parliament is set up, and one of the things that's important to note here is that globally, this movement actually has quite strong roots in Scottish activists. So the organisation that's set up, called the Equality Network, which is set up specifically to take advantage of the Parliament being set up. And this is not, it's not terrible and sinister. They're, Scotland's.
What does the Equality Network, for those people who don't know, what are their aims and objectives?
It's a small charity which has always been, and this is quite important, has always had not just a gay rights, but also trans rights. I mean, they're unusual. They're not like Stonewall. They are a body who, from the very start, have always been in this mix, and they are important. So, obviously, this is not only happening in Scotland, it happens in Ireland, it happens in Denmark, you see it happening most recently in Germany. There's an international move in this direction. The court cases heard in Strasbourg are very important. This is not just a Scottish
activists, but at the heart.
The Scottish activists are really important here. They're very important in a thing called ILGA, which is a big international kind of umbrella organization, which has played a huge part in promoting ideas around self-ID and the supremacy of gender identity over sex over the last 20 years. So Scotland is a place which is deeply embedded, a driver. So there are activists in Scotland who are both looking internationally and networking, but they're also looking at the political change in Scotland. When the Maria Miller investigation happens down in Parliament, it's Scottish witnesses, it's the Equality Network and Scottish Trans who go down and make some of the most important contributions to try and persuade Miller and her colleagues to reform GRA and put it onto a self-declared basis. So Scotland so we have this. I mean, the devolution is important in this story because it gives a focus and a forum where these ideas can be promoted. Now, the Equality Network is doing other very things that would, nobody was worried about, to do with, Section 28, repeal same-sex marriage, all of this, which, perfectly mainstream agendas. But this was always part of their agenda too. And as these other things come away, this becomes more prominent. And you trace back things like the prisons policy, which becomes so important in the story of how self-ID is embedded in institutions. Well, the earliest discussions on that appear to start in about 2007 in Scotland. So these are Patrick Harvey does his private members bill, hate crime bill, which brings in gender identity. It comes into that bill 2009. So these are not things that just pop up in the very recent past. The agenda, which becomes familiar across the world of self-ID, hate crime laws, these things are bubbling up in Scotland quite early, and they're doing it partly because there's, as Susan says, a small political community and quite a guilty political community. Scotland doesn't have a great story to tell at the turn of the century.
Guilty in what way?
Well, we're late to decriminalise same-sex sex. We're late to decriminalise compared to the rest of the UK. People are very guilty about that, and I think I moved up here in the mid-90s from London, and I felt it felt like going back. When I lived in London, I'd had a ton of gay friends. It was just normal, and I came up here just a year or two, and I thought nobody was out. I had no gay friends. And this is very strange to be in this big cosmopolitan city, and it did feel. So I absolutely can see that for the activists in the Equality Network, they had a job, but also, and I think politicians here, I think people were more conservative. I think they did take longer to get used to the idea of same-sex relations, and I think a lot of the Scottish political class is quite guilty that they were late. And if you look at Section 28, when Wendy Alexander stands up for Scottish Labour, says she's going to repeal Section 2A, it's called up here, the SNP's main donor, the man who has been keeping the party afloat, Brian Souter, runs a referendum. He runs the campaign against abolition. He runs a terrible fake referendum on it. He pours money. This is the SNP's main funder. Nicola Sturgeon, when you look at her record in Parliament over 2A, she was kind of a fence sitting.
She was ambivalent.
She was ambivalent. So I think a lot of politicians here are compensating for actually having done a rather bad job around gay rights for a long time.
Yeah. And this is sort of ridden on the back of that.
I think so. I think
one of the reasons.
It's a complicated. It's more than one thing, but it's of the things in that mix. I think there are probably more people who are more uneasy about their own personal history here than would necessarily be true down south.
Well, it's really interesting because women have realised before politicians the impact that this is going to have on women and girls. So I was thinking about the date. You cover 5 years. So do you want to explain why those 5 years? You've got 2018 to 2023.
Well, it started at the beginning of the end, which was the 15th of February 2023, the day that Nicola Sturgeon unexpectedly resigned. Though I have to say that I did get a tip-off the night before that she was planning to resign.
What a well-connected woman you are.
Yes. Well, no, I'm not well-connected.
Okay.
So it was not as unexpected, perhaps, though the rest of Scotland was just like, what?
Yes.
So we had been toying with the idea of pulling together a history of what had happened. And this was such a momentous moment. And it was quite clear, though she didn't admit it at the time, but she did later, that the gender reform work, campaign, whatever, controversy had been part of the reason she had resigned. So when we were thinking about it, we did a little bit of initial research on the timeline, and one of the very first meetings, formal meetings on this subject of self-ID and women campaigners coming together was on the 14th of February 2018 in Edinburgh in the Drill Hall. So there you had almost exactly to the day a 5-year period, and it was just Well, it was it was
It,
too.
it was no, it's
It was
too-
perfect.
yeah. I mean, at this point, I always feel obliged to say there was a previous meeting in Glasgow in January,
Yes, yes, yes. It was.
which had a
Which-
very similar thing. But the Edinburgh one was the one that's sort of nearest to the heart of power. It was up the
Yeah.
road.
Yes.
It was, and it was particularly I mean, actually, the Glasgow one was also disrupted, so they were both targeted for disruption. But the Edinburgh one,
Yes.
I think, it got slightly more attention,
Yeah.
a little bit more attention to the fact it had happened. So it was just, this was the point at which
Yeah, so
it fitted
and a
the story.
5-year period worked really well in terms of constructing the narrative of the book, because it is more than 30 essays by different women from all backgrounds, all styles of writing.
You did the timeline first. Is that how you?
Yes, the timeline was really important
Yeah.
because you need a framework when you're
Yeah.
for any book, fiction or non-fiction, but particularly I think when you've got so many contributors, so many writers, or we had hoped we were going to get them. So we thought, how do we do this? Right, let's work out the timeline first,
Mm-hmm.
and then we started to hang people onto the timeline, and
Yeah.
it was very
I mean,
very easy actually.
Yeah, I mean, there were names early on. You think, well, there are all these people, and then so we did have some names before we had a timeline, but they were kind of sitting in a kind of not quite a parking lot, they were kind of parked. Well, we thought, well, that's all very well, but how on earth would you put all these stories into a book and not have the same story 30 times? Because many of these women have been right through the 5 years, and all the women in this book pretty much could write you a 5-year story. But obviously that wasn't going to be a viable book. So you need something where we thought, well, what's the point where each person particularly has a point to make about what's happening at this point, even if and many of the contributions obviously do stray a bit before and a bit after, but we wanted them all to have a kind of a moment and a point onto which their piece hooked. But having done that, we then thought we've got all this, but then we've got all our new readers. This has to be a book that makes sense to someone who wasn't there. So then you think, well, okay, introductory material at the beginning, and then and then the contributions at the end, which are of a sort where we don't want to hang them on a timeline. They have other reasons for having them in the book. A poem by Maggie Gibson just kind of almost, one of the very first things was. Yes. Well, the other thing we talked about, and I think we got quite a lot of the way there, was we didn't just want it to be dense text of prose. There is a lot of prose in there, but we wanted it to have things like tweets, which we used a lot because it's important. And we wanted pictures. And actually, one of the things that was such a pleasure was that Constable. When we thought, well, maybe get a handful of pictures. We said, how many pictures can we have? 24, I think we have, don't we? And it was just, we have 24.
Great.
Fantastic. Because the whole campaign had been really visual and there'd been such a powerful creative use of visual images, both at demonstrations on social media in other ways.
The banners, the posters,
and there's still, I mean, on the to-do list with the great coffee table book of women's art of this period. It could still be done, and we have way more pictures that we gathered in people's census than we could use in the book, but. So it was that wanting a book that had a story, that had a timeline, that introduced readers to the backstory and gave them a framework that gave you a place to pause and reflect, and that wasn't just words. And the idea for the book, and those ideas probably about the first conversation, pretty nearly. I think we had that construction pretty much the first time.
And you gave people like a period. Was it 6 weeks that you gave?
Yeah, it was very short.
It was totally unreasonable. We were so lucky.
We were very lucky.
Oh gosh, really lucky.
And what was it like when those stories started coming in? Because was that quite an emotional? I mean, I some of these, I think I would have been in tears. Well, I was in tears actually reading them.
And some of the authors were in tears writing them. We knew most of the stories.
Yes, we knew. Well, obviously, because we'd gone to people, but you knew roughly the worst had happened, but you didn't actually know.
It was a big thing we were asking people to do, because we were asking people. I mean, some of the people who have contributed are professional writers, but most aren't. And we were asking them to write with quite a short word count, to write about a very difficult time in either their personal or professional lives, sometimes both. And we needed them to be candid, and we needed them to be readable. It's really important.
Yes, yeah.
I think one of our big fears was, at least it was mine, I think, was that what if we get half a dozen of these essays and they're unreadable, but none of them were. They all came in almost perfect, I have to say.
Fantastic.
It just shows you the level of talent.
Yeah, absolutely.
There is,
but also I think the other thing,
there.
it's talent, but it's also what happens when you write honestly.
Yes,
because
honest,
what
yeah, that's
all
very
our
true.
writers were doing. And in fact, one of the things that we're very grateful to the publisher for, we sort of at an early stage said some of these stories will go into territory which is quite
Yes.
tricky.
Yes.
What do you want us to say about people, effectively, do you want them to hold back and not and self-censor a bit if it could be a bit awkward or a bit uncomfortable for them? And the steer we got was, no, get people to write honestly, and we'll deal with if there's any, if we think it raises a legal issue, we'll deal with that when we see it.
How did you find a publisher? Was that difficult?
It was, to begin with, because we approached a couple of Scottish publishers. The first one took us out for coffee, was really interested in what we were doing, but he thought we had to tell both sides of the story. And we said, no, we
You
can't.
disagreed.
Just no. We all just looked at each other.
That was the easiest conversation ever.
Said no.
Yeah.
And he, to be blunt, was too uncomfortable to publish it. We've all seen the controversies in the publishing industry across the UK about women who have gender critical views. So it was too controversial for him, basically. He gave us some advice on self-publishing, but we didn't want to self-publish. We thought it was an important book, not just because of the main subject matter, but also because it was the first feminist book in Scotland for about 20 odd years.
Well, certainly the first big critique of devolution by women.
Yeah. That's a better way of putting it. And so we thought it was important for that, as well as the actual subject matter. And the second publisher went away, his editorial committee looked at it, and he came back full of apologies, but said there was no market for it.
Oh dear.
Yeah. So we were a bit...
How wrong?
We were a bit stuck at that point, but then...
Yes.
So at the point that the second publisher was pondering, we'd begun to approach people informally, say we don't have a publisher yet, but would you be interested? This is what the book's about. This is kind of timing we want to get out in time for the 25th anniversary of Holyrood, so it will be quite a quick turnaround. Can't promise you it'll get a publisher, but would you be willing? And everyone comes back and says yes. And there's one person on the list who we haven't yet got around to. We think, okay, we should this is one person. We'll go. Let's identify how on earth you get in touch with J.K. Rowling and ask her, because she's in Scotland. She's very important in the debate. It would be bizarre not to have her in. It would look weird to have a book full of, essays by the kind of group of women we've got and not have this Scottish-based influential woman. So all we can do is ask. So of course, at that point, when we contacted her, we didn't know at that point we had a publisher, and we don't know and so the first kind of we get a tentative, well, okay, tell us a bit more. And at about 5 o'clock on one night, we get a message back from the contact through her saying, yeah, she would be interested in contributing. And we go, this is good. And an hour later we get but have you got a publisher yet? And we have to think, this could get quite complicated because we've got this other small publisher and we don't know what that would mean, and maybe she won't be interested if it's just them or whatever. Anyway, about an hour after we get this message question from her, we get the message back from the second small publisher going, I'm sorry, we don't think there's a market for your book. I mean, literally an hour apart. I look in my inbox a few months back to check this out. And at that point, we go, okay, that's fine. We go back and say, no, we don't have a publisher, but if you can help us find one, that would be great. And that's sort of it all goes, it unfolds from there. You know, you have a contact in the publishing industry, you have somebody who is published.
Yeah, wow.
And that helps you find a publisher.
Yeah.
So at that point, we get one, and that, you know, and the timetables are still ridiculously tight because at this point, Susan and I are still maintaining we want this book out for the summer of 2024.
I think you're very determined people.
Well, I think our publishers thought we were crazy.
I think the publisher thought it was absolutely insane
it.
and couldn't possibly marshal 30 people to write. Because at this point, we have no essays, remember. You know, this is some like midsummer, August, late summer August of 2023. And we're going to have this book out in 6 months and it hasn't been written yet. And published going, and the publisher, to do them justice, had a very what they were. I mean, if we'd fallen on fast enough base, who knows what would happen? But they were very good about assuming we could do it until we'd shown them we couldn't.
Yeah.
And that was a great thing. So that
they gave us a deadline. Yeah. So the kind of final agreements were signed in October, I think. So then our deadline was we had to have the completed manuscript in his inbox for the 3rd of January. And I think he thought we weren't going to do that.
No.
I really.
Oh, what a horrible Christmas you must have had.
No. I mean, Susan was fantastic. So we got all our wonderful authors, and I don't think there will never be a point in my life I can be effusive enough about these incredible women who know this is coming, but they don't start writing. We give them all a detailed brief. We explain where you fit in the timeline, what kind of things we'd like you to talk about, just so the whole thing hangs together. And we give them this in about October. Most of them get it, I think.
It's October.
With a deadline for the end of November, which, as you will know, you know, that's incredibly short time. And they are all brilliant. And the ones who can't quite make the deadline are fantastic about coming and letting us know. And of course, if you're getting that many pieces in, you can have a little bit of flexibility. So by sort of mid-December, we have everything. Yeah. And most of it, as Susan says, has come in, and we've both gone, my God, this is good. I won't want to touch that.
Yeah.
Maybe a tiny tweak here, but nothing else. And Susan volunteers to spend the period between Christmas and New Year quietly sitting with this pile of manuscripts, working your way through them, doing the editorial thing. We both did it, but I mean, it wasn't a bad Christmas because you could see it all coming together.
It must have been so exciting.
And we're both used to working to deadlines.
Yes.
So when our publisher kind of went on 3rd of January, that's going to be very hard. Well, no, not at all.
I think both of us work better to
deadlines.
I think both of us work better to quite a tight deadline.
So I think once it landed on his desk, I think, and he realised, and others in the team realised, the quality was there as well as, you know, the subject matter was of interest, and there were some interesting names, but there was also a really well put together story.
And the deal was always that no one name would stick out.
Yep.
It was always absolutely in our minds and in every single contributor. I can't emphasize that enough. That was always the deal. It was a collective thing. The movement had been a collective movement of women at all kinds of backgrounds and levels, and it was massively important to us. And every single person who contributed to our book was exactly the same. So there's no the only names on the cover are the editors' ones. You know, it's not like featuring so and so or so and so. This was always the deal. It was the deal with the publisher. It was the deal, really, as we pulled it together, as we everybody's voice counts.
This is a women's movement and a women's book.
And the thing that I haven't said yet, but I suppose I feel I ought to say, the most, in terms of saying we knew who we wanted, the surprising addition, the critical surprising addition, was this critic who writes the introduction. So at some point, Susan came up with the title, and we thought we'd better look at the origins of Women Won't Wheesht. You know, if we're going to write this book, we better understand the whole history. And I realised I knew it had bubbled up, but I couldn't have told you. Other people knew, but I didn't. So I asked around, and I was directed, did a bit of searching on Twitter, and found this critic's account as the first ever use of Women Won't Wheesht.
Yep.
And okay. And I asked someone, do you know anything about this woman? Does anyone know her? Oh, yes, she wrote this blog. And I go back and she wrote a fantastically moving blog about why she'd come into the movement, at which point you thought, well, okay, at this point, this woman needs to be in the book. And first of all, we think, well, maybe as an interviewee, but actually the more when we email her and she tells us that, oh, she came up with tying ribbons to trees, and we're going, well, okay, you have to have a piece in this book.
Wow.
So we ask her to write for us, and then thinking about it and thinking about where she sits in this whole movement and her story and her daughter's very moving story, we think she belongs at the start.
Yes.
Only place in her piece. You think, where would you hang her in the timeline? Well, she
Yeah.
doesn't hang in the time. She's sort of transcendent to the timeline. She belongs in the introduction, and she writes that very wonderful.
The essence of the book.
I mean, it's very, very moving, and I've read it, but I've also listened to it on audio a couple of times, and that beginning, I cry every time. It's so moving.
When you say what was it like when stuff came in, well, I suppose of all the pieces that came in, I have a very distinct memory of reading it's hers, because she was, because you read it, thought, this is it, and
this is what it's about.
We'd said, do you mind having a go at writing the introduction? Big ask, again in this stupidly short time frame, and she has other things on her plate, as is evident. And this thing came in, and we didn't touch a word of it, and we thought that's it. She's there she is. Fabulous. So that was I want to mention, because there was, although a lot of it was quite neatly planned and fell into place, that was the left field thing.
Yes, very much.
And it makes the book so much a better book than it could possibly be. I cannot begin to imagine that book without that introduction. It just wouldn't be what it is without her voice at the start.
But you could, it's a perfect illustration of the campaign of the 5 years, and the campaign is still ongoing. There are a lot of well-known women in politics, in literature, who have written in the book, who are also who were part of the campaign. But the real strength of it was ordinary women like this critic, who had, most of them had never campaigned about anything in their lives before. Because self-ID and everything that self-ID meant about how civil society in Scotland viewed women and girls, somehow we were negotiable, and that our life
expendable.
That's what this boils down to. And so it is the courage and the imagination and the creativity and the doggedness of those women that meant that the campaign succeeded. It wasn't without them, it wouldn't have.
No, absolutely. And you see, I mean, the one bit of campaigning experience which we did benefit from is that during the independence referendum, that had brought lots of women into political campaigning who hadn't previously been political campaigners, and there's quite a lot of the women. So when you ask why Scotland, well, one of the advantages I think we had was that there'd been this period, and it had been a divisive period in Scottish history, but for those who were campaigning on the independence side, it had also been for many of them, it had been quite an exhilarating experience of campaigning. It wasn't everyone's experience, but it was, very importantly, it was theirs. And they had brought that. And it also, I think, brought a certain, they'd come into politics with more optimism.
And,
in a way that people, if you've been working in a political party and political system for years, you tend to get very, we do this, we tweak that. But these were people who'd come in quite large numbers and encouraged to think on a big scale about what Scotland could be. And they were absolutely devastated. These were women who were totally devastated that a woman, Nicola Sturgeon, they were particularly the sense of betrayal that women who had been and that comes through in some of the contributions to the book, of course, women who felt that they'd really been invigorated by what had happened around 2014 and had followed Sturgeon, who, the big figure, very popular, and had just felt, I think it's hard to express what we were, what we were hearing from them. Very betrayed.
And I think the biggest betrayal was her refusal to even engage with women on this. Women who she had walked alongside during 2014 and the referendum campaign, women who she had depended on for, the Yes campaign. They were now coming to her and saying, Nicola, we're concerned about this. And she just pushed them away.
But she got her comeuppance, didn't she? And one of the things I asked you to do tonight was, because my favourite page, one of my favourite pages in the book is the Peter Smith interview. So I think you're going to do a little performance for us, aren't you?
Yeah.
This was the interview. I think it was
Yes.
on ITV, and I think we all watched it with our jaws slack at the ineptitude of the answers. It was like a car crash interview.
The background to this is that we'd all been campaigning. So this happens after the bill has finished going through Parliament. We'd all been campaigning and making these points, and suddenly the pictures of Adam Graham, Isla Bryson are everywhere.
I know that picture, the full length, the pink leggings.
We did have a discussion about whether the picture should be in the book, but we decided he was not going in our book, no way. But the picture is clearly historically.
Oh, yeah,
there's very few
very
images.
significant.
There's handfuls of times when an image has that political impact, and that was one of them. So the fact that Peter Smith from ITV holds, we were all taken aback because he did it, and he did it really well, and we were all surprised because it wasn't as though this came from a background where we expected the media to do this. We didn't expect the media to take her on like this, and so she didn't either. So everybody, her and us and everybody was surprised that this conversation happened.
Yes, yeah, a picture of Adam Graham, clearly a man in pink leggings with his manhood showing.
Yeah, his penis was poking through his. So it peaked the whole of Scotland.
Yeah, yes. it changed the debate. So shall we have a go at this? I'm not going to impersonate Nicola because I couldn't begin to. I'm just going to do the words, and Susan will play the part of Peter Smith. That's not the point that we are dealing with here.
That's the question I'm asking.
Trans women are women, but in the present context, there's no automatic right for a trans woman.
Oh, so there are contexts where a trans woman is not a woman?
No, there are circumstances where a trans woman will be housed in the male prison estate.
Is there any context in which a woman born as a woman will be housed in the male estate?
Look, we're talking here about trans women.
And I'm now asking about women born as women.
I don't think there are circumstances there, but...
So it's different for trans women?
Well, yes.
Oh, it was painful.
It's also painful because you saw that repeated on the floor of the chamber. So we had the moment where Nicola Sturgeon invented the third gender of rapist.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, golly.
Extraordinary moment. And this played out, and to be fair, so something that needs to be said, that as the whole debate's going on in Scotland through the Parliament, is the Conservatives in Scotland, Rachel Hamilton, who's now deputy leader of the Conservatives up here, and Pam Gosal, who's one of the first two women of colour to be elected. Can I just say that I talked earlier about things we should feel uneasy about. Yes. It took till 2021 for any woman of colour to be elected to the Scottish Parliament. Absolutely.
Okay, yeah.
Just unforgivable. So Pam is one of those two women. The other is on the other side of the fence here on the SNP side, Cockham Stewart. So the Tories actually here did the work. They did all the heavy lifting of parliamentary questioning. There was nothing. The Lib Dems were on the wrong side of the argument. The Greens were driving it. There were, with the exception, and this is actually important to say, the SNP backbenchers who rebelled, who did something that no one had done in the Scottish. So that whole group of SNP backbenchers that rebels is very important, and we need, you need to say mixture of men and women, but what they did was very brave, very, very important. And then, of course, Ash Regan is the first minister to resign. So there are people in the SNP who do the hardest thing, really, which is to defy the SNP whip. But in terms of the questioning on the floor, the driving the questioning, it comes overwhelmingly from the Tories. Actually, and Michelle Thompson also is very good. Yes. So there are handfuls of people in the SNP, but it's the Tories constantly who are really driving the debate.
Because the Labour Party's position, just as Nicola Sturgeon's position on this, was shameful. The Labour Party let down so many women members, women trade unionists. The women's the Scottish Labour Women's Conference, after the first time it met after COVID in real life, passed a motion against self-ID, and yet continually the leadership of Scottish Labour refused to engage with women on this
And in the
matter.
end, they vote for the bill. They whip.
And
They whip.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, it's that. So all that questioning that happens, which happens, it's just so by the time that Nicola Sturgeon is being questioned about Bryson on the floor,
Yeah.
it's against a backdrop where they've evaded and evaded.
Yeah.
Oh, it's just Tories. You can ignore these
Yeah.
questions only coming from Tories. It doesn't matter, which is a very strong Scottish political vibe going on there, and so they're really unprepared. And what becomes clear is that once everybody's really watching and it's on the tea time
Yes,
news, and the
yes,
questions are so simple because these are not hard, these are not abstract theoretical questions about law. But they're really simple questions, and they have been so insulated from proper scrutiny. They have been so casual, so dismissive of any attempt that they don't know what to do. And I think Sturgeon. What happens to Sturgeon? It's not just that people particularly respond on the issue. What they see, it's like the sort of curtain coming back and the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
Suddenly, she's exposed as kind of lost for words, out of control. It's all sorts of things that she's managed to somehow avoid since she took up the role in 2014. She's had this incredible run of authority, and it's the cracks in her authority, which the SNP rebels clearly play a part in as well. Be important to say, but it's that loss of absolute, because the only authority worked for the Nicola Sturgeon when it was absolute.
Yes,
she didn't have a model.
No, and the press all across the UK gave her a very easy ride. She was always the golden girl all through COVID, and this is why, in a way, this book is so important, because you've recorded what's happened. You say it's a small country, but it's small but perfectly formed. But it means that yes, and it means that it's almost like an object lesson.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope that amongst the people who've bought it are world leaders all across the globe, because I'm sure some of them watched that Peter Smith interview.
I'm sure people, I'm sure
Starmer did. People started to roll back and think, oh, how are we going to deal with this?
One reason we were very keen to have when we're thinking about what do we do in the book, we need to have an Irish voice. So having Iseult White write for us for Ireland, it was
of course
that Scotland, yes, this is a Scottish story, and Ireland is one of the strongest parallels, because Ireland was constantly quoted at us as a place. And in fact, I suppose you said why Scotland, but the question is, why Scotland but not Ireland, which are otherwise? And the question is then, well, what was it in Scotland? Because it's not that Irish women lack energy, nous, or intelligence. I mean, the Irish women are extraordinary. So what was it that enabled women here to organise in a way? And I think that's where being part of the UK, actually, and the fact that the issue was being pushed up the agenda down south at Westminster, then helped raise the profile of it happening here. And otherwise, because I think I'm absolutely sure that the expectation on the part of government was we'd be Ireland.
Yes.
And it would just get
nobody would notice.
Go through.
Nobody would notice.
It's happened in Ireland.
So we undoubtedly benefited from groups like yours. So by the time it's happening here, obviously down south in England, we've got all kinds of women's groups making noise about the Westminster. So we're not working in a vacuum, and we never wanted to give the impression in the book that we thought we were. And in fact, the country which probably isn't talked about in the book, the missing part of the jigsaw might be what's happening in England. A book is only so big, but the bigger story to be told about women's activism across the UK won't be written by us, but somebody needs to write the book that pulls in all those women's groups that evolved across the UK.
Now, there's a thought. If there's anybody who watches this who thinks that's me,
or many books, there won't be one. But I mean, the kind of documenting we've done, and I keep saying this whenever we get a chance to anyone, which is take notes. Make sure have you got a box where you put all your stickers and postcards?
I mean, the documenting is really important, because when that publisher said to you, "Are you going to tell both sides of the story?" Well, No, because we are telling what's the phrase? Our lived experience.
Oh yeah.
No, our experience, absolutely. So this is the England features of a kind of background to the book and the story, but it's very important.
It's a story of the Scottish.
It is great. I mean, I hope that people will see this and if they haven't heard of your book before, they'll go out and buy it. And if they have heard of it and have a copy already, perhaps they'll buy one for someone else. That would be good. Put a Christmas present. So where can people buy a copy of the book?
Any Waterstones,
Yeah.
lots of independent bookstores, online.
It's very easy to find in book shops. Waterstones have been very
great cover, great colours.
No, again, the publisher did us proud. So Waterstones have been great. It's still turning up. People send us pictures of it in Waterstones. Like it turns up in independent bookshops. Not every shop has it, not obviously, but
Amazon.
If
you were on the Sunday Times bestseller list for a while.
3 weeks. We were 3 weeks at the highest. At one point we were the highest placing was 3, which is extraordinary.
Fabulous.
In our first week. And we've been to reprint, and we've sold several times over the original print run.
Amazing.
Yeah, so I mean, it's
and it's published in Australia at the moment. It's just out, and it will be published in America and Canada. The week after the American elections.
Any translation plans? German, maybe?
At the moment, the German would be an obvious one. Spanish as well. Not that we know of yet. But as you say, the question is it's a slow burn of an issue, and this is not going to go away. I mean, we had a decision in the European Court of Justice, which only covers the EU, so we're not covered by it. But just this last week, that if someone has persuaded the country they live in to give them a bit of paper that says they're the opposite sex, then every other country in the EU. So that's self-ID by the back door now, because obviously you can pick up those bits of paper in Spain or Germany. Sure, but there's going to be big protests. We know. I mean, we're talking to you at the end of middle of October, 1st of November. The law changes in Germany. There's a huge amount of protests planned. Yes, you just mentioned Malta. Well-known bastion of women's rights. And it is, so yes, this is a book we hope finds an audience bit by bit, where it may take a while to filter into all the places it needs to, but we hope when it does and it lands, it makes people stop and think about what their political systems are being drawn into, because the parallels are very strong. So absolutely.
In the words of the song, this isn't over yet.
Exactly, not over yet.
It's been such a pleasure talking to you. I know we've run over time a little, but it's been such a pleasure. I've loved hearing your stories, and I really did love the book, and I really hope that people watching this know more about it now and go out and buy it.
It's a very simple message at the end.
Yes, it is. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Jane.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Insightful Sisters, and thank you so much to Susan and Lucy for all their fascinating insight. If you've enjoyed listening, we hope you'll follow us on Twitter at InsightfulPod for more updates about future episodes and guests. We'll also link Lucy and Susan's social media, and where you can get your very own copy of The Women Who Wouldn't Wheesht. Absolutely essential reading for all women. We hope to see you in the next episode, and until then, stay insightful.